したいと思います。まずお一方目はダボス会議でもご活躍されていらっしゃいますユーラシアグループ代表イアン・ブレーマー様です。よろしくお願いいたします。
It is an honor and a privilege to be able to address you this afternoon. My congratulations to all of you for the Institute. My particular congratulations to my dear friend, Ryozo Hayashi. We've been working together for a long time. And this is the first time that I've ever been able to share a stage with Kawaguchi-san, who we've known again for, I don't know, almost 10 years now, and it's a real pleasure. It's an honor and a pleasure, so thank you so much. Hayashi-san asked if I could talk about Japan and where the world is heading in the next 10 years. That's getting harder to do. You know, Naya-san started his presentation, opened up today, talking about how in 1989 we had the collapse of the Berlin Wall. 1991, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2012, there are many in the world who believe that we're seeing the beginning of the collapse of the United States. Let me first say that I'm not one of those people. But I do think we're in the middle of a very different collapse. A collapse of the old world order. A collapse of the G7, which occurred in 2008. A collapse of the Western-led order, which the United States was first with its allies, the Europeans, the Japanese, and others. I believe that we are seeing creative destruction happening at a global scale. On one hand, creative destruction is something we're used to. It happens all the time. In the business world. I come from the United States. We've had Borders and Barnes and Noble selling books. And then Amazon comes along. And that's creative destruction. And if you don't adapt, you die. Borders didn't adapt. We're not sure about Barnes and Noble yet. But we welcome that in a free market system because it creates more productivity and efficiency. But none of us have experienced creative destruction in the geopolitical space since World War II. We're experiencing it now. Because globalization wasn't just about the world coming closer together. Globalization was a set of institutions that were created by the United States. American priorities, American values, American institutions, the American economic and political system. I mean, I know we call it the World Bank. It sounds global. We call it the World Series, too. There is a Canadian team. It's not global. And it should not surprise us that in the last 30 years, with the rise of the BRICS, with the rise of emerging markets, with the rise of China, it should not surprise us. The underlying balance of power in the world changed dramatically from the US to China, from developed to developing, from debtor to creditor states. But the institutions that ran the world did not adapt very much at all. So clearly, it was going to take a shock, but at some point, that shock was going to show the discontinuities of the underlying balance of power and the global architecture. We had 9/11, not a big enough shock. We had the Asian financial crisis, not a big enough shock. We had 2008, big enough shock. So now we're in the middle of a new world order. We call it the G20. The idea behind the G20 being that the world's 20 largest economies will get together and try to respond to the world's pressing challenges of climate and trade, financial architecture, security. As you probably know, I do not believe we have the G20. I believe we have the G0, which is an absence of global leadership. That does not mean the US is in decline. Look at the US dollar, it's doing better than it was before because everyone's scared. There's much more volatility. And I'm not trying to be negative on emerging markets. Thank God for emerging markets. If it was not for the growth of emerging markets after 2008, the world would have been in depression. But let's be clear. We are in a world environment where emerging markets are powering more than half of the world's growth. And yet emerging markets are more unstable. They are more opaque. They are more volatile. I look at China. China, in the next 10 years, will likely become the world's largest economy. And yet, if you compare China to the US, or Europe, or Japan over the next 10 years, and think about the range of scenarios for where China will be in 10 years' time, they are exponentially greater than the range of scenarios of the US, or Europe, or Japan. China is not only an emerging market, but they are an authoritarian system, powered by state capitalism. They must fundamentally rebalance their economy and their political system to continue to succeed. They've done very well over the last 34 years. I compare China to a car with a very big engine, going very fast, down a road that has been very straight. In the next 10 years, that road will take a huge turn. But the Chinese have never shown us that they have a very good steering wheel. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. What do we do about that? In other words, if the world shows 3% growth in an economy that is driven by China, as opposed to the world showing 3% growth in a world dominated by G7, that is lower quality growth from a risk-return perspective. It is more uncertain. It is more unstable. So the first thing I want to say to my friends and colleagues here in Japan is the good news. The good news is that we are entering a global economy and political system that is radically more uncertain and volatile. Trying to predict the next 10 years is much harder, which means the Japan model starts looking much more attractive. Why? Because it's safe. Because it's stable. For the last 40 years, we have all paid attention to growth. We want growth. But when you are scared, you don't look as much for growth. You put your money in your mattress. It's kind of the way the Japanese save. It's certainly not because you're getting interest rates on your money. I must admit I don't quite understand this behavior. But clearly over the next 10 years, resilience matters. Look, I have profound respect and appreciation for what the Japanese people have been through over the last year. You have had the worst year, the most challenging year that you have had since the war. You had the worst year of any country, any developed state in decades. the Fukushima crisis and everything around it, and the lesson that any country in the world should take is the Japanese are the most resilient major nation in the world. That's the lesson you take. I was here a few months ago. I heard that there was an Occupy Tokyo demonstration in Roppongi, so I went down because I'm a political scientist. I'm curious about these things. When I saw Occupy Tokyo and Roppongi Crossing, there were 3 people there. And media, there was lots of media. The United States is very resilient too. Again, the US dollar is doing very well. Treasuries are doing very well. The Chinese keep saying that they don't want the dollar. They're very irresponsible, the United States. They want a global currency. I'm more interested in watching what the Chinese do than what they say. Americans too, Japanese too, doesn't matter. Politicians in general, let's see what they do. What the Chinese do is they invest in treasuries, because they know they need safety too. The Japanese have almost nothing to teach the world about economic growth. The Japanese have more to teach the world than almost anyone else about resilience. That will be more true in 10 years than it is today. Japan should appreciate that. They should use that. They should leverage that. That's the good news. I have bad news. The bad news is that the United States and China are not heading for a warm and cozy relationship. U.S. policy in the last year has changed. It's changed dramatically. We now have the U.S. focusing not on the Middle East, where secretaries of state for decades made their stripes. Instead, we have this shift to Asia. Why the shift to Asia? I am not a diplomat. I get to say what I want. The shift to Asia is one thing. It is the United States recognizing that China is its biggest challenge for the foreseeable future. That is what it is. We can talk about welcoming a peaceful rise of China. We can talk about hedging and not containment. We can say whatever we want. But we know what it is. You know what it is. Most importantly, China knows what it is. The relationship is tense. It will get more tense. It is between the world's 2 largest economies, which are trading places. I do not think the world yet appreciates just how much of a change that reflects, just how destabilizing that potentially will be. If you are Japan, and you are living in that environment, what do you do? Because in the old globalization environment, it was very simple. One model, get with the program. Model is globalization towards the West, do well with that model. Japan did very well with that model. Bangalore, very well with that model. Shanghai, well with that model. Detroit, not so much. Singapore, very good. New York, very good. We got it. We understood that model. In the new model, you don't have one group that's doing the driving. You have lots of groups. Lots of countries, they drive different things. In the Middle East, you've got Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Latin America, you've got Brazil primarily. You've got the US, of course, still first and most important among all. In Asia, you of course have China, most importantly, driving integration. In Europe, you have Germany. The most important thing in that environment that anyone can do is to avoid being captured economically, politically, and strategically by one major country that's sitting next to you. You want options. You want to hedge. You want to be, as I would call it, a pivot state. If you're in Europe, you do not want to be captured by Germany. you don't want to be Greece. You want options. If you're in North America, you don't want to be captured by America, like Mexico, which has no other. You want Canada. Mr. Ambassador, don't know where you are, but that's a better position to be in, right? United States decides not to do Keystone Pipeline. Canadians know 1.3 billion Chinese that would like to build a bridge to Canada, right? What does this mean for Asia? This is hard in Asia. And it's hard for a few reasons. It's hard, first of all, because the Chinese and the Americans are both in Asia. And if the American new policy tells you anything, it should tell you America's not going anywhere. They're not leaving Asia anytime soon. But as you all know, integration towards China is increasingly on the economic side. Integration towards the United States is increasingly on the security side. Is that sustainable? To say that that's sustainable, you have to answer yes to two questions. The first question is, will the United States continue to credibly provide security guarantees to you, even in an environment where they receive less economic benefit from doing so? You have to say yes to that question. Once you've said yes to that question, you have to say yes to a second question. The second question is, will China, with increasing economic and political influence over you, allow you to maintain that security relationship? You have to say yes to that too. Japan's not the only country that needs to ask that question. Every country in Asia needs to ask that question. Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam and Australia and Singapore. I was just in Taiwan last week. I met with President Ma on Friday from the Kuomintang, KMT. Just got reelected. I have a meeting with him. The first thing he says to me is Taiwan needs to join the TPP. That's what he said. Taiwan. He said, you know, over the last 10 years, you've had 50 FTAs across Asia. Taiwan's been excluded from the process. Taiwan needs to reach out. We're trying to do a deal with Singapore, trying to do closer business with Japan, need to be part of the TPP quickly. Next 3 years, must be in. I said, will China let you do that? Probably not. He said, going to be tough. Not right now. But if you're Taiwan, even if you understand that you need to hedge, your business community is not hedging. Because your business community is overwhelmingly making money in China. Right? 1.5 million Taiwanese living in the mainland. China's getting more expensive to manufacture. Shanghai, more expensive than it used to be. Guangzhou, more expensive. You know what the Taiwanese are doing? They're all going into the inland China. Foxconn signed a deal in Brazil. I know. It's not serious. Overwhelmingly, Taiwan's future is China. Japan does not want to have Taiwan's lack of options going forward. I am not saying this to you as an American. I'm saying this to you as a political scientist. I'm saying this to you as a colleague of the future Meiji Global Institute. Right? Want to have options. And my suggestion to you is that those options are going to be increasingly challenging to have. Because China's growth is only going to make them radically more influential. So it's key that one thing that Japan needs is to ensure that the US-China relationship is as good as possible. Japan wants a good US-China relationship. On this front, I'm a little worried. In part, I'm worried because the US doesn't look to Japan for help on this front. Right? The US can do it itself. Japan's not a big foreign policy player. Right? Big industrial player, not as much of a foreign policy player. Japan needs to be seen as more of a partner by the US on that front. But also, It's a problem because the U.S. increasingly feels like it has no influence over China. You talk to American diplomats and you ask them, you know that Xi Jinping was just in the United States last week while I was in China. A week before he went to the United States, China vetoed the Security Council resolution on Syria. They didn't need to veto, they could have abstained. A week before the trip. They clearly did not care much about the influence that was going to happen on the United States. When I talk to American diplomats, they say that they believe the U.S. has no influence over China policy. No influence on anything? No influence on pretty much anything. Not currency, not intellectual property, not East or South China Sea, not North Korea, not Syria, not Iran, not currency, not human rights, not Taiwan, not the Dalai Lama. You cannot find many areas where the Americans are influencing China. And to be fair, you can't find any areas where the Chinese are influencing the United States. But there's not a relationship of trust. There's increasingly a relationship of mutual suspicion. Now that's not new. That's not new. But there was much more structural win-win economically between the US and China over the past 34 years. That is becoming more challenging. That's becoming more challenging because of the size of China, the strength of China, and the willingness of the Chinese to use their government to benefit their own enterprises and corporations, these Western multinationals. So I would say, if you are Japan and you're seeing this environment, the next 10 years are going to be increasingly challenging for you to effectively be able to balance. What do you need to do? In addition to trying to facilitate as best you can a strong US-China relationship, TPP on the one side, Japan, China, South Korea on the other side. You do both, you don't just do one track. But another thing you do is you hedge. Taiwanese businessmen aren't really leaving China. Japanese businessmen are going global. They gotta go Indonesia, they go Latin America, they go all across Africa. They have to be as global as possible. If there's one thing that Fukushima teaches Japan, with rising input costs and consumer taxes and demographics not going anywhere and no immigration, it is that if you want to make money as a Japanese business, you better be global. We're learning that. We're learning that. And that is where, if I think about the next 10 years, the more diversity, the better. It's the Toyota model. It's not the GM model, right? I mean, every time I see in Afghanistan a Taliban attack and I see a Toyota pickup truck, it's because they sell everywhere, right? I mean, it's not that they don't like Chevrolets. The U.S. just doesn't have that kind of global reach. That means when things blow up, Japan loses some. But when the rest of the world does okay, Japan does okay. Even Americans don't do this well. Americans overwhelmingly have their portfolios in the United States, despite the fact that emerging markets are growing like crazy. Americans need to become more international, but the country's so big, they feel like they don't have to. Again, Japan here and Japan corporations know this better. They learn this more. And the final thing you gotta do, you gotta have more institutes like the one you're creating right now. Public policy schools, teaching students, bringing together the smartest possible ideas and opinions and analysis to assess an increasingly complicated world. The United States has been well ahead of Japan in terms of its public policy schools. We haven't had the equivalent of the extraordinary think tank community and the Kennedy School and the like. That Japan has not had that. Behind the curve. I can't tell you what an honor and a privilege it is that you invited me to come and be part of this celebration to kick off what is clearly going to be a very important part of Japan's future strategically and future in the world. I wish you all the best of luck and success. I thank you very much.